Chapter 14. Are you a citizen if you can't vote? The best women I know do not want to vote, said Horace Greeley, who was an important newspaperman and politician. Oh my. The woman he was saying this to was Susan B. Anthony, a tall, raw-boned Quaker who had spent much of her life trying to get the vote for women. Best women indeed. Foolish women, thought Susan Anthony. So she went to see President Ulysses S. Grant, who had an intelligent wife named Julia. Grant believed that women could be postmasters and had named 5,000 women to that job. Isn't that enough? He asked Susan Anthony. No, it wasn't enough. What she wanted was justice, not favors. The vote for women was a hot issue. Grant was running for re-election. Suffrage for black men came first, he said. Women would have to wait. Besides, many sensible people thought women's suffrage would be the end to the family. A husband might vote Republican and a wife Democratic. Could a marriage survive that kind of thing? No one knew for sure, but it sounded ominous. But not to people like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, Sojourner Truth, and others who knew that a woman without a vote was not a full citizen. Those women had worked hard to abolish slavery. They believed that abolition went hand in hand with women's rights. But many male abolitionists, like Horace Greeley, were ignoring women's rights. The women felt betrayed. The 15th Amendment said, "The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Anthony and Stanton, who were the nation's leading women's rights leaders, wanted the new amendment to read race, color, sex, or. But even sympathetic congressmen said that the amendment would be difficult enough to get passed as it was. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1869 and became law in 1870. Now the question was, who was a citizen? Were women citizens? As you know, it wasn't a question at all in the territory of Wyoming. Of course women were citizens. Few people in the West pretended the women were dependent on men. But in the East, it was hard to break old traditions. Women had never voted. There was something else, too. Many of the women reformers were working for temperance as well as the vote for women. Temperance advocates wanted to put an end to the drinking of liquor. Some men who might have encouraged women to vote were afraid that voting women would close their bars. They were probably right. In 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded to battle drunkenness. Women went into men-only saloons. Carrie Nation went with a hatchet and did some chopping in those places. Carrie, like Sojourner Truth, was a powerful 6-foot-tall woman. Men ran when they saw her coming. But all that was besides the point to Susan Anthony, who believed, as the colonists had in 1775, in no taxation without representation. Women could be taxed, but they couldn't vote. Women could be arrested, but they couldn't serve on a jury. In 1871 in Washington, D.C., 72 women tried to vote and were turned away at the polls. That same year, 3 women in Nyack, New York, and 1 woman in Detroit, Michigan did vote. The New York Times wrote an editorial. No evil results followed. Susan B. Anthony in Rochester, New York, did a lot of thinking about the 15th Amendment. It said that all citizens could vote. Anthony visited a friend, lawyer Henry R. Selden. He had been a judge on the New York Supreme Court. Was she a citizen? Could she vote? She asked. Selden thought the answer to those questions was yes. That was all Susan B. Anthony needed to hear. It was November 1st, 1872. She and 15 other women marched to a barber shop in Rochester's 8th Ward. 3 men who sat there were registrars. Their job was to register voters. They were stunned by the woman's request. The women wanted to be registered to vote. The next day, the newspaper was full of the story. So were newspapers in other parts of the nation. Mostly, the newspapers disapproved. Lawbreakers is what the women were called. But on voting day, November 5th, the 16 women were at the polls at 7 a.m. When they voted, that big news went by telegraph from Maine to Florida to California to Washington. 23 days later, on Thanksgiving Day, a tall deputy marshal knocked on Susan B. Anthony's door. He looked uncomfortable and stammered a bit. "Miss Anthony," he said, "I have come to arrest you." He had a warrant in his pocket. It said she had broken an act of Congress. That day, the other 15 women voters were also arrested. They were brought to court. Anthony was asked if she had gone into this matter for the purpose of testing the question. "Yes, sir, I have resolved for 3 years to vote," she answered. She was ordered to appear before a grand jury. The 3 men who had registered the women were arrested for registering and accepting ballots unlawfully. The government decided to prosecute Susan B. Anthony alone. She would represent the 16 women. The 3 men would all be tried. It was January. The trials were set for June. They had 6 months to prepare. The judge may not have realized the kind of woman Anthony was, or perhaps he did, and that's why he was afraid to let her vote. She was a fighter and unafraid. She used those 6 months well. She spoke in all of Rochester's districts. She talked about the Constitution and natural rights. She used Thomas Jefferson's words, unalienable. Rights were not something that governments owned and gave out to people, she explained. They belong to each of us. People are born with rights. Governments are formed to protect those rights. She called them God-given rights. She also talked about the hateful oligarchy of sex, which meant the rule of men over women. Half the people were ruled by the other half, she said. "We the people" does not mean we the male citizens, she said. And she added, it was downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty. The Rochester judge did not agree, but he was smart enough to know that most people in Rochester were being swayed by Susan Anthony's speeches. So he had the trial moved to a little town 28 miles away. 28 miles was a good distance in the horse and buggy days. When the day came, the courtroom was packed. A former president, Millard Fillmore, was one of the spectators. Newspaper reporters sat with their pencils sharpened. Judge Ward Hunt was the foe of women's rights. He wouldn't let Susan B. Anthony speak for herself. He judged her incompetent. Anthony's friend, lawyer Henry Selden, said, "Every citizen has a right to take part upon equal terms with every other citizen." And he said political bondage equals slavery. Judge Hunt turned to the jurors. Under the 15th Amendment, Miss Anthony was not protected in a right to vote. Therefore, I direct that you find a verdict of guilty. Now, this was something no judge has the right to do. Judges can tell the jury about the law, but they can't tell the juries how to vote. The clerk of the court said to the jury, "You say you find the defendant guilty, so say you all?" No juror said a word. Judge Hunt said, "Gentlemen of the jury," of course there were no women, "you are dismissed." The judge ruled Susan B. Anthony guilty. Not a juror had spoken. Most were outraged. Now the issue was no longer the vote for women. It was an issue of a free trial in a free society. This trial had been a joke. Anthony's lawyer reminded the court of Matthew Lyon, who had been in prison and fined for saying bad things about President John Adams. That was during the time of the Alien and Sedition Acts, when free speech had been in trouble. Later, the court apologized, and Matthew Lyon's fine was paid back with interest to his heirs. That didn't matter to the judge. Susan B. Anthony and the 3 men were fined and sentenced to jail. The New York Sun wrote of a jury of 12 wooden figures moved by a string pulled by the hand of a judge. A Utica, New York paper said Judge Hunt had outraged the rights of Susan B. Anthony, even though the paper's editor didn't think women should vote. Another newspaper said the right to trial by jury includes the right to a free and impartial verdict. Susan B. Anthony refused to pay her fine, and Judge Hunt, perhaps knowing he had gone too far, never demanded it. She did not go to jail. No appeal was ever heard by a higher court. The 3 male registrars spent 5 days in jail. They didn't mind it a bit. While they were there, they ate fancy meals sent by the 16 women they had registered. Then President Ulysses S. Grant pardoned them. At the next election, Rochester's male voters re-elected them by a large vote. But Susan Anthony and America's women lost out. If she had won that court case in 1873, women all over the nation would have been able to vote. The word citizen in the 15th Amendment could have been interpreted to mean men and women citizens. Judge Hunt decided things otherwise. At the time, many men and women too believed he was right. It would take much work by Susan B. Anthony and others to change their thinking. It would take another amendment, the 19th, before women had the rights of full citizens.